Hey, welcome to my corner of the internet. Today we're talking about in the beginning. Everybody knows this phrase, it's famed. It's been around in the translations of the Bible. It's obviously Genesis 1:1, and it's how it starts. But is it a mistranslation? I was watching a debate recently between young Earth and old Earth creationism and the possibility of evolution being biblically compatible. And there's good points on both sides of that argument, but that's not what this video is about. A point that was brought up in that argument was the idea that there could possibly be a mistranslation in the use of in the beginning. It could be a mistranslation of the Hebrew phrase, and it could therefore mean something different. It could mean when God created. And some people have argued, some scholars have argued that it should be translated when. Today we're going to take a look at the antithetical evidence and the reason why I believe it should absolutely be translated in the beginning. And I'm also going to address the repercussions of that with the old Earth argument, or the argument that there could have been something created before Genesis 1:1. So if we're looking at Genesis 1:1, this is the common expression, okay? It's Bereshit bara, is in the beginning God created, or it would be Bereshit Elohim bara, is how we translate it, although the actual reading of the Hebrew text in this direction is Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning created God, but the way that it reads, obviously, to us is this other reference. And so these are the important words here, and the most important being this Bereshit. And there's some debate about this, obviously. And I'm no expert on Hebrew, so I'm not going to speak to necessarily whether it should or shouldn't be translated that way from a Hebrew perspective. But what I am going to debate from is other scripture, because I think that other scripture is the most powerful tool that we have for interpreting this. And I think the most important aspect of that comes from the New Testament. The New Testament quotes Genesis 1:1 clearly, I think, 2 times. And we're going to look at both of those instances. The first is John 1:1, which is actually my favorite verse in the Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, the rest of the conversation that John gets into in chapter 1 of the book of John, it is clearly that this whole passage is a reference to Genesis 1. It's absolutely clear that he's drawing those parallels. There could be an argument made that he's not, but I think the evidence speaks for itself. I have a video on the Gospel of John separately that kind of goes into it a little bit more, but I think it's absolutely clear that this is referencing creation, and it's definitely referencing Genesis 1:1. It's clear that John is trying to tie in the beginning of the original scriptures with the new gospel, and he's doing that using this very famous expression, in the beginning God created. Instead he's saying in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God when he created. And that's the point that he's established. In verse 2 or 3 he goes into nothing was made without him. So he's obviously talking about in the beginning God created, obviously drawing the reference back to this first verse. But if we look at the phrase that's used in Greek, it's en arche, okay? And so this is obviously meant to say in the beginning. It's en, which is a transitory vocabulary, in, among. You can see it there. We can take a look at the Greek as well to prove this. You can look at it in more detail. And then arch is a commencement. It's a start. It's a beginning. We can go look at the instances of this real quick for some quick evidence here. Your wives from the beginning. It's translated beginning every single time. Beginning, start. He was in the beginning, the beginning, the beginning, the beginning, the beginning, the beginning. It can also be translated corners, which is interesting, but that doesn't really, you think of corners as like starts, the 4 starts of the sky, the 4, institutions of the sky. But either way, I think it's clear that this arc from which we derive arch, first, primary, is obviously a preceding terminology. Okay, so en arch is in the beginning, and it clearly should be translated that way. For a second evidence, we can look at Hebrews 1:10, which is also a translation. It just says, "You, Lord, in the beginning of the earth, lay the foundation, and the works of the hands, and the heavens are the works of your hands." It's something along that as the actual translation. Obviously, we're looking at the specific word-for-word translation here of the Greek, and he uses essentially the same expression. He's using a derivative of the same Greek word, which we can take a look at again. This one is archos, which is still a derivative of that arch, and you can see it's again always a reference to beginning. since the beginning of the world in Matthew 24, uses the same language. Mark 1 uses it to describe the beginning of the gospel. So it clearly has that same meaning. And this kat is used for in rather than en. It's not this intrinsic expression, but kat has this kind of, it's like a downward facing, and you can see some examples of that here. In a dream, in a dream, in a dream, in a dream. It's sort of this, it has this other idea. You can also mean against. So obviously you wouldn't translate this against the beginning, but you could see the idea of it there is still as a transitory word, but it's clearly referencing this arch point. So we have that reference to arc in both of these, especially in John 1:1. I think it's clear that en arche is the absolute way to go. And so what I think that does is say that the New Testament readers clearly took it as saying in the beginning. And the last evidence for that is the Greek Septuagint, which is a fairly reliable Greek translation of the Old Testament, which also renders Genesis 1:1, the original verse in question. If you were to look at it in the Septuagint, it translates it in the same way as John 1 does, which is en arche. So you get that same use case when you're looking at the Septuagint, which means that they also have the same idea about it. So you'd have to go into the argument that they were all wrong, that John was wrong, and what I believe is an absolutely inspired book of the Bible, the book of John, the most beautiful of the Gospels. You have a hard time convincing me that John was wrong about this, especially with his intimate knowledge of Jesus and the message that he was meant to deliver, and the message that he's intending to convey here. Not a thing was made without him that was made. So no thing was made without Jesus, who was in the beginning. And he's drawing this to Genesis 1:1, which makes it seem like in the beginning. So what does that mean for the ramifications of the argument that perhaps some things could have been created before Genesis 1:1? And Genesis 1:1 is describing a specific creation of just the heavens and the earth. So maybe Satan and the angels existed before Genesis 1:1. Maybe the darkness and all of that existed before God created in 1:1. Maybe there was chaos. Maybe there was failed creations. Maybe there were these other things before Genesis 1:1. It's possible. That's not the argument that I'm trying to make today. The only argument that I'm making is that Genesis 1:1 should absolutely be translated in the beginning, not when. It definitely is not intended to insinuate that when God decided to create the world was formless and void. It's not saying that at all. It's saying in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, either after he created it or when he created it. But the point is, it's at the beginning. It's at the beginning of creation. And the biggest evidence for that, once again, I think, is John 1, saying, when he says that, not a thing was created that was created, in John 1, let's take a look at that exact passage here. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. It's clearly making that insinuation that all of creation, everything that is created, was made with Jesus precedent. And if Jesus had to be present before all creation, and this is a reference to Genesis 1:1, then Genesis 1:1 has to take place before all of creation. The only argument that you can get into here is whether we're talking about a separate creation. I think that seems unlikely, but there's a possibility for a case to be made there. You could argue that it's just the heavens and the earth, and Jesus was, the earth that we see and the heavens that we know of that are described to us. There could be worlds outside of it. There could be much more that's done. We have no idea about those sorts of things. But at the very least, I think the final solidified argument is that this should be translated in the beginning, and all of these things happened in the beginning of the creation of our heavens and earth, not when, not in an intermediary period later on, and certainly not afterwards. That's all I have for this video. If you found this interesting, feel free to comment, like, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. I appreciate any interaction that you have. Let me know your thoughts on this subject, and thank you for tuning in.